These are the top 5 decks of the Emerald Dream. In this video, I'm going to be showing you guys the best decks in Legend, the best decks to hit Legend, a couple of honorary mentions, as well as some meme decks that I believe will get you to enjoy every single aspect of the Emerald Dream. But before we get into those decks, I want to give you guys an announcement that I am throwing my own tournament. That's right, we're doing another HELLSCREAM Cup. I don't believe we've done this since the Great Dark Beyond, and we are now taking a look at the Emerald Dream and making our own custom rules with Conquest. We're doing a Swiss tournament, top 16 bracket. We're gonna have casting, we're gonna have prizes. Everything will be available in the description below. If you want more information, our Discord will be a great place in order to get that information. But if you guys want some fun Hearthstone tournaments, check out our tournament on April 25th at 9 a.m. EST. And we're going to have a lot of fun during this tournament. Before we get started on the first deck, I just want to let you guys know that this is going to be very general rundown over these decks because there's a lot of decks that we have to get through. So if there's any particular deck or list that you want me to do a deck guide about, please let me know in the comments below because I have a lot on my plate. I have a couple of deck guides from a couple of days ago that I need to get done. I just have way too much stuff in order to do right now. There are so many decks that are playable in this format, and the reason why Ashamane is the card in the thumbnail is because this card is starting to make a ginormous splash onto the meta, where I have several decks in this video that are going to be spotlighting Ashamane. But the main point of this deck is that Pirate Rogue is really good right now. The whole thing about this deck is to get value from your Crystal Cove, then play Lucky Comet, and then have your Bargain Bin Buccaneer summon 3 5/5s with Rush so you can dominate the board as well as pressure your opponent going into the next couple of turns. But the real big powerhouse in this deck is Sandbox Scoundrel doing ridiculous amounts of mana cheating thanks to Shadow Step, Prep, and even Saladrassil. You are wanting to play your 1 mana Scoundrel into Saladrassil in order to get this value as quickly as possible so you can get Nightmare and Dream very effectively. These are going to be the most common cards you want to get out of most decks that play Saladrassil, and you're not even worried about corrupting this card because you don't really care about the corrupted versions of the cards. You just care about getting that immediate damage as quickly as possible. Another great thing about this deck is that it runs Harbinger of the Blighted, so you have those early game scams enabled with Shadow Step, but it also runs Dream Planner Zephyr, so there's a lot of different ways of pressuring damage, somehow throwing out a bunch of mana of cards, which is not typically the good option, but you're either going to go for impacting the enemy battlefield with some AoEs or playing some damage to try and set up lethal. But overall, this deck is extremely powerful to where there's another rogue deck that we need to talk about. And for the sake of prosperity, we are including these decks as the same deck because they are effectively playing the exact same core, but they have a couple of different changes in here, most notably being the inclusion of going all in on pirates, playing Hosen Roughhouser, as well as a Sailboat Captain. This has by far been the most popular deck at Top Legend for the past couple of days, and we are starting to see the latter become very volatile against it by playing decks that are very good into Rogue, and we will tell you what those decks are once we get to them. But Pirate Rogue is absolutely insane, and I would make the argument that Marin actually does have a spot in this deck simply due to the fact that you have 1 mana Scoundrel into 4 mana Marin, you can Shadow Step the Scoundrel back, and then you can play Crown for immediate value on the same turn. You could do this as early as turn 5 if you have the coin and if you have all the proper cards to set this up, and that is just an insane amount of tempo from this deck. There's also insane toy boat turns where you can cycle through your deck, play a bunch of pirates, draw almost your entire deck by like turn 6 or turn 7, so this deck just has a lot of gas in the tank, but again, it is very dependent on those Crystal Cove turns, so this is what you're going to want to mulligan for. This is the main meat and potatoes of the deck, to where it also works with the Buccaneer, but more notably, it also works with Water Cannon. You can easily set up a turn 3 Cove into a 4 mana Water Cannon and deal 8 damage immediately while enabling the rest of the deck with cards, you know, like your Hosen Roughhouser, and you can even set up Sailboat Captain the next turn. So there's a lot of little specifics, little intricacies that are very particular with this deck, so it is an easy deck in order to build, but it is not exactly the easiest deck to master because there's a lot of little things that you could mess up. Moving onward to the second deck, it is Drunk Paladin. Drunk Paladin was a deck that I originally kind of dismissed as like a deck that just kind of, you know, just played Sea Shanty as early as possible. But this deck has kind of gone through some changes, and now Flickering Lightbot is a real card in Standard because of how many holy cards that you are playing. I have seen a Flickering Lightbot 8/8 come down as early as turn 4 because cards like Divine Brew, Dragon Scale Armaments, Life-Saving Aura, not the sunscreens you get from the aura, but the actual aura itself, Aegis of Light, Flash of Light, Hand of a Doll, they're all holy cards. Same thing with the Holy Glow Sticks. So you have so many ways of just jamming spells, playing your Flicker Lightbots in order to make a big minion, but you also have other ways of increasing your smaller minions like Vicious Slither Spear or Righteous Protector, thanks to the cards that you get from Life-Saving Aura. Now, one thing to keep in mind, Sea Shanty specifically says it costs 1 less for each spell that you've cast on characters this game. That doesn't necessarily mean your own characters, that means any character. So if you play Manager against your opponent in order to remove a card, that will discount the Sea Shanty. So knowing your discounts, knowing exactly how much mana your Lightbots are going to be at is a little bit of a skill check with this deck. Obviously, you have Ursol into Saladrassil as like the main win condition in case all of these other cards are not able to get there, but I'm gonna be honest, I don't really see Ursol and the Saladrassil that often. You are mostly just going to win by playing light bots and having 1-drops that just become extremely big extremely quickly. Next up, we have Hog Demon Hunter, and this deck is still looking like it is the best version of Hog Demon Hunter at most of the ranks. There's a couple of lists at top 1000 Legend that are running Jump Scare, and I'm not really sure who or what particularly popularized this card in the deck, but I personally don't like it. I understand the reason for it is that you have, more potential scams off of Cliff Dive, but there's a lot of circumstances where this card just mucks up your card draw. Suddenly you don't want to draw that demon that you just shuffled into the deck. There might be a couple of high rolls with like a Ferocious Fellbat after you play your Fell Hunter, or maybe you get like an Illidari Inquisitor or a Mag Discover from this, so you have more consistency from your Cliff Dive, but I really don't believe in this card. It's kind of funny, but Dangerous Cliffside is a card that I thought was not that good, but now it just seems to be a very good staple in the deck, so that way you can have some good removal against some aggro decks. You have more synergies with your Defiled Spear. It just feels like this deck has exactly everything that it needs, and it doesn't really need to take out cards unless you are teching specifically for a different meta or a specific deck. So this deck is still looking like the most powerful of the Hog Demon Hunters that are out there. So if you want to see this video, if you want to see this deck in action, we already have an entire video showcasing exactly how to play it, but simply put, you just really care about hitting that curve. You want Grim Harvest, Slumber, Pig into Fell Hunter almost every single game in that sequence, because when that happens, a lot of decks are just simply unable to deal with it. Sitting at the number 4 slot, I am actually going to put in Big Buff DK, and I believe this is another deck that you can check out on our channel that we already have a deck guide over, but I really do believe that this deck is insanely consistent. If it wasn't for the Rogue meta at top 1000 Legend, I would actually put this at almost my number 1 spot because it's very good into Demon Hunter. It's got a pretty good matchup into Paladin. It can actually pressure late game decks like Blood DK, although it is its worst matchup, but there are times where you do get enough buffs in order to threaten decks that gain a lot of health or decks that are just trying to stall out the game. Sometimes with this deck, the longer the game goes on, the better your minions are going to be and the better your synergies are going to be, especially when you consider how big you can make your Darkthorn Quilter, and then you can slap Poisonous on there to where you're going to kill the board, deal some damage to the face, and if this minion sticks, you're just going to automatically win. That is really the power of this deck, is that you have several turns that you can play where you just play one big card, a couple big cards, and it's like, all right, deal with it, or you're going to die next turn. So this deck is a very good, very skill testing deck that does have, that typical I win card by turn 5, but with Saladrassil being very common, it's not that unusual to see your Puppeteer get returned to your hand, so be a little bit aware of that depending on what matchups that you are going up against. But Handbuff DK is looking like a very solid deck in top Legend that has personally been my highest win rate deck of the season. And last on the list in the top 5, I'm going to be showing you guys 3 different versions of Wheel Warlock because Starship is making a comeback. It's looking like it actually might be better than the Wisp deck, but I can't help it. I love the idea of actually main decking Wisp, so that way I can draw it from Eat the, or I can draw with it with Eat the Imp. I can throw it out of hand in case I don't have enough cards in order to enable the Yor combos that are possible, because this deck is really all in on playing Yor as quickly as possible and then reborning it with cards like Eternal Layover. And if you can get a little bit more lucky, and if you can play another card in this combo, then Curse Campaign into Eternal Layover on your Yor will automatically win a lot of games, because your opponent is not going to be able to deal with the card draw that you have, the resources you're going to draw into, as well as the actual life gain and armor that will sustain you. So that way every single aggro deck is like, well, the wall's been built, I can't get over it. So this deck has a lot of skill testing turns that are possible. It's not going to be simple to just pilot this deck and then have the best win rate, which is why a lot of different people have really teched this deck to be good against specific matchups. Now, what you're seeing right here is a deck that hit rank 1 legend from Caravaggio on the NA server, and he made this deck all in to bully Rogue. That is why we are running Hellfire. That is why we are running a Drain Soul in order to stop some early game tempo. But this deck is just all in at playing the removal control Warlock game, and then when you need to transition into the wheel and kill Jaden, you do have these cards available in order to beat up some slower control decks and stuff like that. Like Blood DK has really fallen off at top 1000 legend, so your control matchups aren't going to be that aplenty. So you absolutely need ways of dealing with the more tempo aggro decks that you're going to be encountering on the ladder. So that's why I just really like this version of the deck. One thing I was sleeping on for the longest time is how good the Starship can be when you just play Fellfire Thruster and you have Lifesteal enabled onto your Starship. So if you end up playing, you know, a layover on your Fellfire Thruster, that's 4 minions that you can potentially trade into, 6 minions if you play both of them. There's just a lot of comeback potential and a lot of awkwardness against aggro that really makes this deck probably the best version of Starship Wheellock out there right now. But that doesn't mean that the cooking stops there. No Hands Gamer has come out with his own version of Wheel Warlock, and honestly, I have no data to back this up, but since we're talking about Wheel already, I just thought I would throw all these decks together in order to give you guys the most amount of information pertaining to this deck. Because Deadline kind of makes sense if you're dealing with Paladin, for example, or maybe up against a Rogue that plays like a 5/5, and now you have a way of dealing with it. I really don't know what else this card is for outside of maybe bullying Rogues and Paladins, but we are seeing it. Not to mention that this deck is also running Soul Searching. I'm not exactly sure why we're running this card in particular. We're not running Starship pieces. I guess the only reason why this card is in here is to get an extra copy of Ancient of Yore, or maybe in some other circumstances you can play Ceaseless in order to get 2 copies of it. But here's the thing about Soul Searching. It is discover a card from your deck. It doesn't necessarily need to be a card that you have to spend the corpses on to get 2 copies of it. You might just run this card in order to find your Ultralisk Cavern, your Eternal Layover a little bit more consistently, or like I said earlier, finding your Ancient of Yore, so that way you can play this card as quickly as possible. So the more that I think about it, the more this card makes sense, but I've had 0 games with this particular build, so if you do decide to play this deck, watch No Hands Gamer's streams and see how exactly he makes this work, because I believe he is making this work around top 50, almost top 25. And now that we've talked about the best decks in Legend, let's go ahead and talk about the best decks to help you on your climb to hit Legend. And right now, Imbue Druid is everywhere at Diamond through Legend, and the main reason why it did not make the top 5 cut in Legend is because Rogue is a very unfavored matchup that is going to be very common once you do hit the Legend ranks. Other than that, this deck is very good at bullying the Imbue decks, or it's very good at bullying some of the Menagerie decks that you'll encounter on ladder, simply due to the fact that you are going to outboard them and you are going to use your minions to trade into their minions and then stick your board more consistently than they will. So this deck has just got a lot of gas in the tank. It has Trail Mix for some mana cheat turns. It's got Zephyrs for comeback mechanics. We've got Grifta, so that way you can mind control a minion that might be a little bit too big, especially in the mirror. If you hide it behind a taunt, now you can get through that taunt as well. Saladrassil just makes a lot of sense in order to give us more burst, as well as that, 7 mana, zap a minion back into the hand, and then give one of your minions +5/+5, just a very consistent win condition. You have Malorn which I honestly don't think is the greatest in this deck, but every single deck that I am seeing with Imbue Druid is playing Maloran, so I am just going to trust the data. And then in my personal opinion, I think that Ziliax makes a lot of sense, so that way you can have a little bit of some game against Rogue, because if you have just a little bit of lifesteal and a taunt, it is probably just going to win the game in a lot of circumstances. And don't forget, you do have Trail Mix and Innervate in order to play the Ziliax a little bit sooner than most opponents may expect it. So there's a lot of things going with this deck. Yes, it is push button a lot of the time, but it is actual minion based combat. Trades versus going face is going to be very important to balance. So if you want to play some Imbue Druid, now might be the best time, because it finally looks like we have found the good list. Next up on the decks that are perfect for your Legend grind are going to be decks like Protoss Rogue. This is one of those decks to where it's absolutely fine right now, but it does somewhat get outclassed by other Rogue decks that are popular at top 1000 Legend. But the issue with those decks is that sometimes they're not the easiest for a lot of people to play. This deck I wouldn't necessarily say is that easy as well, but this is just the Rogue deck that seems to be performing very well at Diamond through Legend, and then it completely falls off when you do hit Legend and you start seeing top 1000 Rogues playing a lot of Pirates and a lot of Ashamanes. So Protoss Rogue is finally being, put off to the side compared to the other Rogue archetypes that are available in the Emerald Dream. But this deck is still powerful enough to where you could definitely hit Legend with this, especially if you're on a little bit of a budget. The only thing I would recommend is that Harbinger of the Blighted and Twisted Webweaver absolutely need to be in this deck, because you are shadow stepping a bunch of the same cards. You're playing multiple Void Rays. You have Scoundrel plays that are available with this kind of stuff. So it's like just having these minions for some early game pressure as well as some actual ways of cycling through the deck feels like a very big W if you want to actually play some Protoss Rogue currently. But in my opinion, this might be one of the worst Rogue lists if we're talking about playing good decks and trying to gain ranks. Next up, we have Zarimi Priest, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about this deck, but what I will say is that Zarimi Priest is not nearly as powerful as you think it is. The biggest issue with this deck is that it absolutely folds to most tempo decks that are out there, so against like a Druid that has more board than they do, against a Paladin that's going to have a taller minion faster than they will, and against a Rogue that's just going to do everything better than the Priest in terms of developing a board. The biggest thing about Priest right now, and the reason why you're seeing double repackage and double Ancient of Yore, is that this deck has transitioned from being like, an all-in aggro deck with like a combo win condition to essentially becoming a full-on combo deck with just a little bit of tempo in order to help, its early game turns. That's why Prize Vendor makes its way into here, and I'm not really sold on this card in particular, but this was the highest win rate deck that I saw on Diamond through Legend stats last time I checked on HS Guru and on HSReplay, so I just find it particularly interesting that Prize Vendor does have a way of being fitted into this meta, but it, of course, is not going to be in a Murloc deck. Murloc decks are just very bad right now. So this deck having a little bit of extra card draw, having the consistency of those very important removal turns, and then of course playing your dragons and having your Zarimi combo enabled by Gnarlex, Ysera, and Briarspawn Drakes, this deck needs a lot of stall and a lot of skip turns, essentially, to get to the massive skipped turn. So you have cards like Bob, you have cards like Repackage in order to just buy those 1-2 turns that you might need in order to finally make it to your Gnarlex combo. So unfortunately, Zarimi Priest, in my opinion, became a lot more degenerate. But how degenerate, there's only so much degeneracy that you can have when skipping a turn is your main win condition. So unfortunately, Priest is being held up by Zarimi because there's not really a lot of things going for the class at the moment. Next on the Diamond through Legend decks, I believe that Blood DK is absolutely a slaughterer of noobs at every single rank. I truly believe that the main reason why this deck is not seeing more competitive play is due to the fact that, number one, Rogues really complicated things because now queuing into a Rogue isn't an automatic win. Sometimes you have to worry about Ashamane shenanigans getting in the way of your W's, and sadly this is not one of the easiest decks to play, so when you end up throwing out your AoE a little too soon, you are going to find yourself, in a circumstance where it's like, wow, I really wish I kept this card around. I wish I would have taken a little bit of damage with my face and then played my Pyromancer combo. So Blood Control DK is definitely definitely in a little bit of an awkward spot, but if you're in love with control decks, this is about as good as we're going to get until we get the mini set, because Warrior's not doing that good, Control Priest is completely laughable. I tried playing a Control Paladin with Pyro Quality in that, but it just doesn't seem to be that effective. If you want to play Control right now, you are either playing Starship or Wheel Warlock, or you are playing this version of Control Blood DK. One thing I'm not 100% sold on is Scarab Keychain, but there's a lot of really good 2-drops that you can discover, such as, you know, Infested Breath. Can you discover Vampiric Blood right now? I don't think they've changed the triple rune discover clause, but you can just find a lot of very useful cards from your Scarab Keychain, as well as giving you a good 1-drop. But if you don't like this card, you can easily sub it out for an Orbital Moon, so that way you have other ways of interacting with your Ancient of Yours, as well as giving your Pyromancer lifesteal. But a lot of the time, I saw the data of this card not really be that good, so just going for some good old tempo might just be better than going for a potential lifesteal combo that really doesn't help you win the game. And the last deck for the best decks to climb to Legend is going to be Zerg Egg Hunter. I hate including this deck, but it really is the best Hunter deck available right now. The nerf to Amphibian Spirit definitely slowed down this deck enough to where it's not being the best deck at all ranks, but it actually still has some sustaining power at the lower ranks. Even though Spawning Pool is 2 mana, this is pretty much the only deck that can actually utilize this card anymore, because Location Warlock is way too slow in my opinion. But sometimes having the rush from this card is just important enough in order to clutch out certain victories, because this deck does not like playing from behind. It needs to build up the most unkillable board possible and then have like an extremely good Hydralisk turn to remove the board or send a bunch of damage to face, to where it doesn't matter what your opponent's going to do, you are going to just overroll them with a gigantic board. And you've even got cards like RC Rampage as well as Ziliax in order to really enable and support the token synergies. So Egg Hunter really didn't change all too much. I think this might be the exact same 30 list that people were already playing, but it just goes to show you Hunter doesn't really have a lot of interesting options that a lot of people are considering, and it just doesn't look that fun overall. So Hunter, in typical Clark HELLSCREAM fashion, I can't recommend it if you want to play for fun, but if you want to get some easy games, if you want to watch some Netflix while playing a certain deck, this is probably the way to go about it. Next up, we have our honorable mentions list. Now, these are all decks that I really wanted to put either in the top 5 list of the Legend decks, or even just like shouting them out in the Diamond through Legend grind. But a lot of these decks are either very high skill based, not very good according to the stats, maybe have unfavorable matchups that you'll counter very commonly on the ladder, or just will require so much practice to where you just need to play only this deck in order to have success with it, because sometimes climbing with a deck really is just a numbers game. If you're weak into Rogue but you're beating everything else, then sometimes you just have to take the L against the 15-25% of Rogues that you'll be encountering while you are beating up on all the other 75% of decks that you are experiencing. And the reason why I'm saying this is because Murmur Shaman is still a deck that multiple players, not just one, but multiple players have been able to hit rank 1 Legend with this deck, especially on the EU and Asia servers. You don't really see this deck on the NA server, at least I haven't been seeing it all too frequently, but whenever I go up against it, it feels like this deck just combos me on turn 7 every single time. So if you do have that consistency and you're able to combo by turn 7 because of your Murmur and your Parrot Sanctuary synergies, then this deck can be a very effective way to grind the ladder. But again, Rogues are not exactly the greatest matchup for this deck. You do have Lightning Storms and you do have Baking Soda Volcano, but there's a lot that goes into those matchups. There's a lot of tempo and a lot of minions that you have to deal with, and every now and again you play an AoE, they summon another board, you're like, wow, I wish I had another AoE. So this deck really is a skill testing deck that I would not recommend unless you are going to be okay with losing a couple of games in order to get over the skill ceiling that this deck does produce. So if you want to play some Murmur Shaman, avoid the Rogues, bully some of the Warlocks, bully some of the slower decks, and you will absolutely slaughter everything that doesn't kill you in the early game. Next up, we have Cards Rogue. There's really not a good name for this deck, but the person that made it just called it Cards Rogue, and I do plan on talking about this deck in a future deck guide, because this deck is a sleeper in my opinion. You take a look at this, you see cards like Creature of Madness, and you're like, why are we playing cards like this? Now, I can't give the full rundown of this deck, but essentially what you are trying to do with this deck is that you're just trying to play tempo, you're just gonna have, you know, minions on the field, and you're really just trying to spend mana so that way you can make it to your big scoundrel turns, so that way Ashamane or even Zilliax can come down very early and automatically win the game for you. I cannot tell you how many times I played Ashamane with this deck, did my turn, and then my opponent just immediately conceded because they're like, I'm getting outvalued, I'm not going to be able to stop this, I am now dead going into the next turn. Cards like Tallgath are making his way into this deck. You have Mixologist, you have Dream Planner Zephyrs, you still have the Lucky Comet in this deck because sometimes finding another Tallgath, finding a Buccaneer, finding even an SI7 agent can be very good with this deck because you are just focused on removing everything your opponent can do. And when you combine all of this with Harbinger of the Blighted scams that can happen very early on, there's a lot of just free wins that get generated with a deck like this. But the reason why I didn't put it in the top 5 decks is because this deck takes a lot of navigation, knowing what the right outs are. It takes a little bit of practice in order to, you know, play the curve properly, because a lot of guys will probably end up playing Lucky Comet or something like, you know, some other play other than Creature of Madness on 2, but Creature of Madness on 2 is so important to just get that 3-drop, play it for tempo, have a big minion on the field, and then maybe you have coin into Scoundrel into something else. So this is just one of those decks where it's like, it really doesn't look that good, but the more that you play it and the more that you realize the options that are available here, it really feels like this deck could technically beat any deck as long as it has the right draws, the right randomness, as well as the right tempo turns. So Cards Rogue is going to be a highly recommended deck coming from me, but unfortunately I don't have enough games and enough knowledge to really show you guys just how good this deck is. But top Legend players like Homie, Insane are doing very well with this deck, and this deck is starting to become very popular, especially in the Chinese server. So there's a lot of potential for Rogue right now. Ashamane is absolutely killing it in terms of interesting decks to play, and I just find that a deck like this being playable and actually good is a very positive thing for Hearthstone right now. Next up, we have a liberal version of the Pirate Sea Shanty Paladin, and in my personal opinion, I really don't think that this deck is better, but it has some amazing high roll potential if you can get your hands on your weapon. This is just one of those cards where it just feels like Libram Paladin can't ever be good because this weapon literally makes everything happen, and if you don't have the weapon, you essentially don't get to play your deck. But the reason why people are doing this, and this was actually a list that was made by World Champion Glory. Glory thought it would be a good idea in order to maximize the amount of holy cards in your deck in order to get good value from your Flickering Light bot, but more importantly, if you take a look at how many minions are in the deck, you have Libram of Clarity in order to draw 2 minions, and since there aren't that many minions in this deck, you are only going to be drawing Righteous Protector, Vicious Slither Spear, your Researcher, or your Flickering Light bot. There's almost no other minions in this deck, so you are trying to maximize the potential of your Libram of Clarity, giving you a very good card in the moment. You're going to keep cards like Vicious Slither Spear, your Interstellar Researcher, as well as your weapon in a lot of circumstances. So Libram of Clarity has some very good options of always hitting that Flickering Light bot if you are lucky enough. So this is just one of those decks where I feel like Drunk Paladin is already good enough by itself. The Libram Paladin archetype is going to be very dependent on this weapon for as long as it's in standard, and unless we end up giving Paladin the 1 mana Alador, the 1 mana discount for Librams, I really don't feel like this deck is ever going to have staying power because it is way too dependent on hitting the right turns on the right times. So if you want to play Libram Paladin, I wouldn't recommend it, but it is a very decent deck that actually does have some decent numbers backing it up, but unfortunately, I just really don't feel like this deck is that good because it really is all too dependent on this weapon. Next up, we have Starship Rogue. That's right, Starship Rogue is starting to make a comeback, and it's doing very well at top 1000 Legend, but this is probably the highest skill cap deck to play for Rogue at the moment, not necessarily because the deck is doing anything too crazy difficult, but because there are so many options, it's easy to get lost in the sauce, and sometimes you might make a play that throws the game without even realizing it. Jay Alexander has been playing a lot of Starship Rogue and has been speaking its praises on his stream, so if you want a streamer to go check out that is playing this deck, Jay Alexander is going to be my biggest recommendation. And I even lost to this type of deck in an open cup because my opponent was doing ridiculous things with Tez Greymane. He was getting really lucky and getting a bunch of biopods back. Unfortunately, I lost a biopod in Rogue in a matchup where I really needed him not to find the biopod, but that just goes to show how powerful this deck can be when it does do exactly what it wants to. And once again, we're running Harbinger of the Blighted as a way of cheating games, scamming games as early as turn 1, turn 2, so maybe Rogue does need this card to be a little bit nerfed in order to bring it down a little bit, because there are just so many Rogue archetypes that are not only using this card, but are just really good at dominating early tempo, and this is always something that I say about Rogue. Rogue is one of those classes to where once players can kind of figure out what's good in the class, then they can start optimizing things, then once decks are optimized, we see even more optimization in order to beat up those rogues. So it's just like whenever I see Rogue doing bad at the beginning of an expansion, give it a week, give it 2 weeks, people will find out the good stuff, because now we are drowning in Rogue archetypes right now. Starship Rogue, Aggro Pirate Rogue, Value Greedy Ysera Ashamane Rogue, Tempo Ashamane Rogue, and now Ashamane is still finding its way into Starship. So I think this might be the best Wild God in the entire expansion, not only because it is very good, but this card is just omega fun. I love seeing Ashamane in a lot of Rogue archetypes right now. And speaking of starships, we're even playing Starship DK. Now, I don't think that this deck is better than Control. I don't think this deck is better than Handbuff. But for some reason, whenever I queue into this deck, I feel like my opponents just have the perfect draws every single time. Because the real power of this deck is not just because of the Starship pieces giving you constant tempo. It's that gigantic Starship that you get to play. It'll be, you know, hopefully more than 10 attacks. So that way your Soulbound Spires are going to be in that gigantic Starship, summoning 10 drops. You have a lot of ways of just generating a gigantic board that a lot of people can't deal with, and you can space out these threats over multiple turns. So I really feel like Starship DK does have a lot of potential with it, but I can't seem to get results with it. The data does say that this deck looks very powerful, but it starts to fall off at top 1000 Legend. But on your way to Legend, if you're not working with Blood DK very effectively, this might be a simpler version of the deck, because you have cards like Guiding Figure, Soulbound Spire, your Arcanite Defense Crystal that you just want to jam on those right tempo turns, and then you have cards like Pyro and Poison in order to get rid of the board after you've developed your tempo, Dirty Rats in order to deny the combo decks. There's a lot that's within here in order to kind of be good into the meta, but unfortunately its consistency on hitting its tempo turns isn't exactly there, and that might be the main reason why this deck is not nearly as powerful as like Handbuff DK or even like Control Blood DK. But again, Starships are good. They are meant to fly. They're working in Warlock, they're working in Rogue, and now they're working pretty decently in DK. So if you are somebody that really didn't get to have that much fun in the Great Dark Beyond with Starships, now might be your primo time to hit Legend with some Starships. And the last deck that we'll be talking about in our honorable mentions is Protoss Mage. I have heard so much rage, so much complaining, so many people that just want Colossus to be nerfed and destroyed, and honestly, I get it. I totally get it. This is not an archetype that I want to be popular, mainly due to the fact that it has a lot of stall mechanics, like Sleek Skater, for example. This card just is super good against any deck that is going to play a minion with 8 attack or more, so that way you just keep stalling the game, gaining a bunch of armor, hiding behind the wall, and then that way you're able to play your Colossus into Youthful Brewmaster. That's right, Youthful Brewmaster is finding its way into the meta, and it is not exactly a good thing, in my opinion, that essentially this feels like a Rogue deck, you know? Where it's like, I'm gonna just play so many Colossuses, I'm gonna remove your board and then put this back into my hand, and I have armor, so there's just nothing you can do in order to defeat me. You somehow have to beat this deck in the early stages of its development while it's not gaining armor, while it's not playing its removal spells, but it just really feels like if you don't have a deck that can go up against this, you will hopelessly die as they just freeze your threats, completely ignore you on the board, and then just throw Colossus in order to win the game. So if I remember correctly, I believe this is Brian Kibler's least favorite deck to go up against right now, mainly due to the fact that you have to out-aggro it. Anything greedy is just not going to sustain very long against it. So if you want to play a deck that absolutely bullies people, Freeze Protoss Mage might be your way, but I'm gonna be honest, I really hope Blizzard does something about this in the future, because if this deck becomes good, I am not gonna like it. And now we get to talk about the fun decks of the meta. That's right, there's a lot of fun decks where I have 27 total deck codes in the description below. Make sure you check out that link in order to get the deck codes, because we are playing Spell Mage in 2025. That is right, manufacturing error and Yogg in a box. What more could you want? We have Yogg in the box. This is going to be the time where decks like Yogg in the box Mage can be pretty decent, because we have the least amount of cards in the pool, so that way Yogg in the box has the most consistent possibilities of clearing the board, summoning a board, or just straight up killing you. There's a lot of content that could come from this deck, and if you just want to see what Hearthstone can do, go ahead and play Yogg in the box, because people are unironically always playing this card on turn 8 because it's just, let's see what's in the box. And then you have the, the Galactic Orb in order to cast yet another box, as well as everything else that you are playing in this deck. Saladrassil, I'm not exactly sure how good this card is in the deck, because you have a lot of, madness that can happen and a lot of hand space issues depending on how exactly you play the deck. But what I am showing you right now is a very heavy tempo version of this deck that is mostly trying to be like a spell burn mage, where you have ways of interacting with cards like Frostlich Cross Stitch in order to remove some minions, set up your own tempo, and then you have Fireball, Frostbolt, Flame Geyser, random discovers in order to just throw everything to your opponent's face. Now, I do have another version of this deck that I would recommend if you do want to slow things down a little bit. I encountered this version of the deck on my ladder grind, and honestly, there's a couple of cards in here that I'm not really that sold on, but one card I am definitely sold on is Blizzard in the deck, because sometimes it really feels like this deck just gets completely out-tempoed by like a Paladin or sometimes a Rogue, to where you really do need this freeze turn in order to make it feel like a control mage rather than just going all in on playing tempo and burst options. And fun thing about this archetype, the reason why Spell Mage is starting to see play, especially at top 1000 Legend, is because this deck is favored into Rogue. So it's unbelievable how the Rogue archetype is starting to fall because of the control tools that Mage has. Cards like Rising Waves, for example. If your opponent plays a bunch of 5/5s out of nowhere, you can then play Rising Waves into Sheebreeze Chalice in order to deal with those 5/5s pretty effectively. So there's a lot of removal that is available in this deck. Like I said, it's kind of like a control version of Mage that is aiming more towards removing your opponent's tempo and then gassing them out with cards like Fireball, even Fireland's Portal. So it's like, if you want to slow it down a little bit, if you want to work against your opponent and then start slamming them in the face, I would recommend this version of the deck. And one thing that I have to point out, Spark of Life. There is a possibility of using Spark of Life to discover a Druid card to give you Final Frontier to either discover cards like Mecha'thun or Yogg-Saron. So there's a lot of randomness that can happen in this deck, and sometimes you just need to put in a little Spark of Life, a little bit of spice in the deck in order to really see what your archetype is capable of. Because there's a lot of madness with this deck. We will definitely be making a deck guide over this, but I'm gonna tell you right now, I didn't win a lot with this deck, and that's because the deck didn't let me. Yogg in the Box is the most let's see what happens card in the game right now, so you live and die by the RNG, and you definitely are going to live and die by the randomness in the Yogg in the Box. Next up, we have Ashamane Ysera Rogue. Now, we've already talked about this deck in a deck guide, so if you want to check out that video, it has so far been our most successful deck guide of this expansion, because this deck is just insanely fun. The whole point of this deck is to play Gnarlex into Ysera, and you can use your bounce cards like Shadow Step and Web of Deception to bring back the Ysera. The Gnarlex is still going to keep it at 1 mana, so you can do a bunch of mana cheating, and then you can play cards like Treasure Hunter Eudora, Maestra Max Merchant, or even play cards like Ashamane in order to get a bunch of value depending on the state of the game and what you need in the moment. So this is just one of those decks to where I would recommend playing this against your friends, playing this against, you know, like a casual gamer or something like that, because this deck unfortunately has completely faded and completely fizzled out of the ladder. But oh my god, the moments that I have had with this deck are still my most favorite moments that I have had from the Emerald Dream. So if you want to see what this deck can do, go ahead and check out the deck guide about this. I believe the title of the video was Ashamane Rogue Made Me Love Hearthstone Again. And just see the power of Ashamane, the power of treasures, but more importantly, the power of dragons. Because there's not really a lot of interesting ways of using Gnarlex. I was about to say outside of Priest, but that's not a very interesting way of using the card. So this really is the most interesting way to use your Gnarlex at the moment. Now, if you're somebody that really likes that Gnarlex combo and you want to go all in on trying to make this good into Rogue, there was somebody that was really trying to get me to play this deck, especially when it was becoming popular at the time, but unfortunately, I really doubt that this deck is that good because you are essentially going all in on Gnarlex, Ysera into Briarspawn Drakes. That's right, you're doing the Zarimi OTK in not a Zarimi deck. So you're pretty much going to have to win with your tempo. You're going to have to put your opponent to a very awkward life total, and then you can maybe win with Briarspawn Dragons if you do have your Gnarlex combo. But I'm going to be honest, I think this deck kind of takes away from the fun aspects of it. You took away the Eudora, you took away the Maestra, but if you're someone that is trying to make this kind of deck into a consistent deck, then this might be one version of the deck that you might want to take it into, because it really feels like you gotta go all in on tempo, but it also feels like we don't really have a lot of tempo. I don't know. I can't really recommend this deck if you're trying to win, but I figured it was at least worth showing you guys because we were talking about Ysera OTK. Next up is for all the Warrior players out there. I have bad news. Warrior is the worst class in the game right now. There's just no arguing it. It does not do anything better than any other class right now. It's got no strengths. It's got nothing but weaknesses, and it is not good into this meta that is very populated by Rogue and Paladin decks. Sadly, in order for Warrior to be good, you really need that element of surprise, and when I saw that someone was able to reach top 100 with this deck, I was very much surprised. I don't know how they were able to do this. This deck seems to be all in on playing Tortolan Traveler, getting a card like Ziliax very early on, maybe getting a Tortola early on so you can chemical spill it or something like that. But then you have Carnivorous Cubicle. I don't really know what you're trying to do with this deck, except maybe you can use Cube on the Ancient of Yore. Like, this just feels like a very complicated control deck that is possible, because it is even running a Yamato Cannon with no other Terran cards in the deck, by the way. So that means they are literally running this card as a 4-mana 3/3 destroy a minion that also will destroy another minion when you happen to launch the ship. So there's a lot of removal, there's a lot of specific draws that you really want to hit on the right turns. I just really don't see the overall power of this deck, but that is the reason why I'm putting it in here. Maybe someone in this video can figure out just how good this deck actually is, or maybe this is just bait and you shouldn't play it. I really don't know, but I'm not gonna find out. So if you have been looking for a interesting Warrior deck, I've got this deck plus one other deck that I saw in an actual Open Cup tournament. I want you guys to just look at this deck. I want you to look at it. Somebody made this deck, put it into a tournament, and then happened to play out the tournament with this deck. Now, I don't know if it won. I don't know how effective it was. All that I know is I beat the guy that ran this deck, and unfortunately, this is just such a spicy idea that I feel bad for putting him down, because he's running Frothing Berserker, he's running Quality Assurance in order to draw the right taunts in the deck, like the Illusionary Grey Wings, as well as Yosandre. You're also running cards like Ancient of Yore in order to slow down the game a little bit. You're running Succumb to Magnus. You're Frothing Did I mention the Frothing Berserker, by the way? There's a Frothing Berserker in this deck. What is going on here? You have Exarch Akama that makes the Stranded Spaceman an actual big brain inclusion in the deck, because if you have a board that sticks and then you have your Akama with Rush, you just have an insane amount of damage. Like, I just don't understand how exactly this deck is trying to pop off this combo, what turn thresholds you're really trying to hit, how often you're going to be able to kill your opponent, because you have cards like Giftwrath Whelp, Dark Rider, and Broodkeeper for like early game synergy, but then you have like this turbo late game combo. It really feels like there are too many cooks in the kitchen, but I could not help but showcase this deck in the video because just look at how interesting this is. And Warrior, this really does show how crappy of a circumstance Warrior is in right now, because this is a deck that people are making for it. So it's just like, it's a very interesting build. It's an S tier cook in my opinion, but in terms of power, I gotta give it an F or a D. It's just really not that good. I completely trashed this deck when I went up against it in the Open Cup, but damn does this deck look spicy, and damn are we probably gonna bait some people into playing it. So if you're looking for an interesting Warrior deck that is for sure gonna take your opponent by surprise, here you go. I don't even know what to call this Warrior. We'll just call it Everything Warrior, because good lord, it really does have everything in it. We are finally down to the last two decks, and I have gotten a lot of questions on whether or not I am going to play Freeze Mill Warlock. I am not going to play this deck. This deck is way too complicated for me. I don't nearly understand enough in order to make this combo work. It feels like it's a little bit unnecessary when Wheel Warlock is already as good as it is. There's not a very heavy control meta for us to want to queue this into. There's a lot of aggro, and I do not feel like going up against aggro with a deck that is just going to get rolled by them. But this is a deck that was made by Maxi. He technically hit rank 1 with it, but there's a reason why he's not playing this deck anymore. At the time, it was a great, mind game in order to take your opponent by surprise, have this weird-ass win condition that nobody understood how it worked until suddenly we saw the clips of this deck just popping off. It is insane what this deck is capable of, but it is insanely difficult. This is probably the most difficult deck to play at the moment because of the synergies and the interactions you need to be aware of. I am not going to play this deck. There's already a Dane video showcasing what's possible with this deck. I made my deck is barren video that really goes to show the potential of what this deck can do. But in terms of consistent win rate and trying to have success on ladder with this deck, you would just be better not playing this against the ladder. So if you want to have fun with the game, definitely try out this deck. But oh my god, warning, MMR warning, if you care about your ranks, this is not a good deck to play whatsoever. And last and maybe most interesting, Sleep Demon Hunter. Yeah, that's right. Remember how we took out the crystal core and we took out the crystal that gave us armor? What if we instead ran Sleepy Resident as the card we want to bring back from the Ravenous Fell Hunter, so that way your opponent has to respect the Sleepy Resident, trade into it, have their minions not be able to attack, and then suddenly you rinse and repeat as the entire game progresses. I don't know how good this is. I tried this myself at the beginning of the update when I was like, maybe this could work instead of Armor Warlock, and it was close. It was very close. And the reason why I believe this deck might have a little bit of a chance of being particularly maybe kinda good is Sleepy Resident into Cubicle. I feel like if your opponent doesn't have a way of dealing with the cube, doesn't have a way of dealing 6 damage, that just automatically wins. Because if you have this that is summoning a Sleepy Resident every single turn that is going to disable your opponent's minions, you can play whatever behind the cube. You can just play your Ravenous Fell Hunters for tempo. You could even play your Royal Librarian for tempo, which I don't really know why this is in here except maybe to deal with Paladins or... I don't know. There's a lot of decks that are kind of decent to silence at the moment, but they really don't make that much of an impact unless you silence them the moment they do their good turn. So if you want to play a little bit of an interesting Demon Hunter deck that has the most toxic mechanic, the most resident sleeper mechanic in the game, then Sleepy Demon Hunter. It might be a thing. I don't think it's a thing, but I saw somebody playing this deck at top 3,000 Legends. So... you never know what you can encounter in the Emerald Dream. There are just so many archetypes to take advantage of. But there you guys have it. Those are my choices for the best decks in the game, the most fun decks in the game, as well as some of the most interesting decks that I have seen in the last week. If there's an archetype that I haven't talked about, or if there's a deck guide that you really want to see in the future, go ahead and leave a comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are. And honestly, I'm just really happy to say that the Emerald Dream has been an absolute success since this balance patch. I know I was very negative at the beginning of it, but oh my god, I'm having so much fun. And going for top 1000 legend, top 100 legend, it's still stressful, but I'm finding a way to not go completely crazy on this journey. So thank you guys so much for making it to the end of this video. Make sure you sign up for the tournament we were talking about in the beginning, and we'll see you for the next video.